Hi, everyone, and welcome to the third and final episode of Love, Lust, and Sexual Desire, the U.S. Presidency in the Bedroom. So let's jump into it. James Buchanan is my least favorite president in U.S. history, and I won't even try to hide it, and I'm obviously biased in this opinion, but I really just don't like him. However, he is a very interesting case study for when it comes to presidential private history, as Buchanan is the only U.S. president to remain a lifelong bachelor. However, before we dive into the president's unconventional love life, I want to talk about Buchanan as a man and his presidential legacy, as I feel it will help paint a better picture to fully understand the contentious timeline of events I'm going to cover later. I mean, he is a man who essentially let the Union fall apart. That's a huge deal, and it's honestly the main criticism of him. But the others include his friendliness to Southern interests and his refusal to take a side on slavery, which ultimately only deepened divisions. In fact, it's quite remarkable how sympathetic Buchanan actually was to Southern interests, given that he is a Pennsylvania native. Although the South, prior to his presidency, held much of the power, Southerners were almost becoming a minority in the country. With the Industrial Revolution expanding the North into a manufacturing powerhouse, its influence and residents grew substantially, and the country was no longer one-sided, I guess you could say. But Buchanan didn't realize this. In fact, his cabinet was, according to an article by Michael Todd Lantis in the Journal of the Civil War Era, consisted of, quote, 4 Southerners, 1 elderly Northern statesman, quite agreeable to Southerners, and 2 additional Northern men who were considered dough faces. In the end, Buchanan's cabinet did not even represent a range of interests and opinions within the Democratic Party, much less the nation. So this was Buchanan's first problem. He was surrounded by yes men with interests that didn't represent the nation, and he did nothing about it. The other problem was that Buchanan liked the South more than he liked the North. He loved their way of life and even tried to emulate it by building his own version of a plantation home in his house in Lancaster. But the final reason, and I think the most influential, was his relationship with William Rufus King, who was at the time a senator for Alabama and a former vice president under Franklin Pierce. Buchanan and King were very close, and I think it's undeniable that King had a major effect on how Buchanan prioritized the interests of the South. None of these reasons make up for the disaster that ensued, obviously, but I don't think that Buchanan intentionally caused the destruction of the Union, but he certainly didn't stop it. And unfortunately, he has to live with that as his reputation. And boy, has it followed him. But what's also interesting about the way that we treat Buchanan is that when he's compared to Lincoln, he looks even worse. I think that Lincoln is one of the most celebrated presidents of all of American history, and to that effect, most of it is justified. And while I'm not going to get into all the problems and bad things that Lincoln did, I don't think it's a coincidence that we all collectively think of Buchanan and Lincoln as the bad and the good guy, respectively. And being the guy that came before Lincoln, I'm sure doesn't make it any easier. All that being said, I wanted to dive into the life of Buchanan and talk about his troubles in the dating world. So, James Buchanan was born in rural Cape Cove, Pennsylvania, to wealthy Irish immigrants on April 23rd, 1791. He entered Dickinson College at the age of 16. 2 years later, he graduated with honors. Given that he had been expelled previously and had a reputation as a boisterous young man who frequented bars, several people who knew him at the time were shocked that he even graduated at all. But as a bright young lawyer in Lancaster, the state capital at the time, back then, men who wanted to study law really had 2 options. Either they attend law school or they study under the supervision of a practicing attorney. Buchanan chose the latter and began to study law under James Hopkins, who was a leading attorney there, and in 1812 he was accepted into the Pennsylvania bar. Now that we have that foundation, I want to go back a few years to when a young James Buchanan met the Coleman family. The Colemans were one of, if not the wealthiest families in all of Lancaster, and they were extremely well known in their area because, as a bright young lawyer in Lancaster, the state capital at the time, back then, men who wanted to study law really had 2 options. Either they attend law school or they study under the supervision of a practicing attorney. Buchanan chose the latter and began to study law under James Hopkins, who was a leading attorney there, and in 1812 he was accepted into the Pennsylvania bar. Now that we have that foundation, I want to go back a few years to when a young James Buchanan met the Coleman family. The Colemans were one of, if not the wealthiest families in all of Lancaster, and they were extremely well known in their area because, Buchanan was studying under Hopkins at the time, he almost became incorporated into their family and social circle, and even became known as a mini Hopkins to the surrounding community. As I said, James Hopkins was very respected, and no surprise he was one of the wealthiest families in Lancaster, so obviously they were friends with the Colemans. So this part of the story is still up for debate, but as it goes, Buchanan, a 17, fair-haired, 6-foot, beautiful young man, started his daily walks past the Coleman house from Hopkins' office to the courthouse. During this time, Buchanan gradually gained the trust of the Lancaster Society and eventually was accepted into its most exclusive group, the Iron Circle. This group was no surprisingly made up of the most wealthy families in the area, which were involved in the iron business. Two notable members of the group were coincidentally both the Colemans and the Hopkins. By this point, Buchanan had advanced far enough in society that by 1812, he was chosen to be one of the 3 managers for a high society event. Shortly after that, he was accepted to the neighborhood Masonic Lodge, the pinnacle of social acceptance. He was also named one of Lancaster's most eligible bachelors. So, through his walks from in front of the Coleman house, Buchanan in 1819 fell in love with Anne Caroline Coleman, the 23-year-old daughter of Robert Coleman. She was petite, dark-haired, with beautiful sparkling eyes, and it was no doubt that she was a great catch. Buchanan began to regularly pay a visit to Anne and her family in the Cornwall mansion in Lebanon County, Pennsylvania. By 1819, Buchanan had established a firm reputation as a successful lawyer and politician. However, he was by no means even close to Anne and her family in the social hierarchy. This didn't excite Anne's father, but it does paint Buchanan as a man who was able to woo the daughter of one of the most influential families from his character alone, which is honestly quite impressive. Ultimately, Anne and James got engaged in the summer of 1819. There's strong evidence that Anne's father was aware of Buchanan's former reputation and, more specifically, lack of family status. Robert Coleman, Anne's father, had hoped for a better marriage for Anne among Philadelphia elite, but as Buchanan came from a common family, he was a bit disappointed, to say the least. But it appears that Anne didn't really care, and the couple had every intention of marrying. However, in the fall of 1819, there was a financial crisis, and Buchanan started to spend more time in Philadelphia as the Cambridge Bridge Company, in which many Lancasters had financial stakes, was at the center of one of the most significant litigation cases of the day, which Buchanan had taken on. During these months, Buchanan was busy and very devoted to his work. And consequently was less devoted to his courtship. James was so preoccupied with his job that he failed to see how all this time apart affected Anne. There were rumors that started to circulate about the pair, who had become the primary subject of local talk within Anne's social circle, which obviously upset her. There was a developing perception that Buchanan was only into Anne because of her father's wealth and had absolutely no interest in capturing her true affection. All these issues came to a head when James did not write Anne while he was on a business trip in Philadelphia, which raised Anne's suspicions. Once he got back, James made his first visit to the residence of his client, William Jenkins, the head of the Farmers' Bank. The stability of his bank during the Panic of 1819 hinged on Buchanan's business operations. It turned out that the Hubley sisters, Mr. James's 2 nieces, were there, who were also Anne's friends. Grace Hubley, one of the sisters, had previously accompanied James to gatherings and activities. She secretly sent Anne a note stating that James had visited her first without Anne's knowledge. When James finally got home that night, the servant told him that Anne did not want to see him. Later, Anne broke off their engagement in a furious letter to Buchanan. The next day, Anne decided to see her sister Margaret in Philadelphia to ease her pain at her parents' encouragement. The fresh surroundings did little to ease her grief. On the contrary, she was reportedly a wreck. A woman who showed indications of anxiety or depression during that time was often labeled as having female hysteria. Landium, a drug with around 10% weight opium by weight, was the standard therapy for female hysteria. Such a dosage was administered to Anne on December 9th, 1819. She never woke up after that. It's impossible to tell whether this was a suicide or a simple dosage error which resulted in her death. However, some people have come to believe that Anne intentionally overdosed before she passed away. We can never be certain. However, we do know who was held accountable, which was James Buchanan, her ex-fiancé. James was devastated with grief when he learned of Anne's death. He immediately sent a tearful letter to Mr. Coleman asking to see Anne's corpse and accompany her in the funeral procession. In this letter, he stated, quote, "Happiness has fled from me forever," end quote. Despite this heartfelt request, Anne's father declined it, and she was laid to rest at Lancaster, Pennsylvania's St. James Episcopal Church on North Duke Street. James Buchanan was not in attendance. James always said anytime someone asked him why he remained single, he would always say, quote, "Marry I will not, for my affections were buried in the grave," end quote. James Buchanan remained in the terrible sorrow of Anne's death, while allegations of his involvement in her murder circulated around. James's friends felt it was better to get him out of town, and they later put him up for Congress, and his political career took off, starting in 1821. For the following 40 years, Buchanan's career would keep him in the nation's capital, concluding with his presidency. That was the story of Anne Coleman and James Buchanan. And now I want to pivot a bit and talk again about William Rufus King. The year was 1834, and King and Buchanan were senators for the U.S. While King was originally from North Carolina, who helped build the city of Selma, Alabama, Buchanan was a long-term resident of Pennsylvania. Their political backgrounds were distinct. Buchanan was a pro-bank, pro-tariff, and anti-war Federalist when he first joined the party, and he continued to hold these positions even after the party's demise. King, a Democratic Republican or Jeffersonian Democrat, opposed tariffs, backed the War of 1812, and had a lifelong dislike of the National Bank. Both men had been drawn into Andrew Jackson's political world and the Democratic Party by the 1830s. Along with their political affiliation, Buchanan and King had another crucial thing in common. They both had never been married and were bachelors of the time. King had never had any serious relationships with anyone, whereas Buchanan obviously had Anne Coleman. But the two were a pair for the ages. King and Buchanan, two middle-aged bachelor Democrats, each possessed a quality that the other had not. King radiated good manners and social elegance. His peers described him as, quote, "brave and chivalrous," end quote. His odd habits sometimes led others to see him as feminine. In contrast, practically everyone favored Buchanan. He was funny and liked to drink with other politicians. King might be quiet, but Buchanan was brash and extroverted, and they were a bit of an unusual pair when they were seen together. They shared a common boarding house while in Washington, so they were essentially roommates. Their first boarding house included other congressmen, the most of whom were also single, giving rise to the affectionate name of their residence as the Bachelor Mess. The group's number decreased over time as other members lost their congressional seats, from 4 to 3 to just 2, James Buchanan and William King. The Washingtonian Society also started to pay attention. They were sometimes called Mr. Buchanan and his wife, Aunt Nancy and Aunt Fancy, and years later, President John Tyler's considerably younger wife, Julia Gardner Tyler, also referred to them as Siamese twins. The pair not only hung out together and lived together, they also wrote letters to each other when they were apart. Only about 60 letters still remain as many were either destroyed or simply lost, and most of those that remain are not available to the public. However, one letter that I found between Buchanan and Cornelia Van Ness Roosevelt, wife of John J. Roosevelt. For context, King had gone to stay with the Roosevelts for a few days, and Buchanan was left alone in their house. Buchanan wrote, quote, "I envy Colonel King the pleasure of meeting you, and would give anything in reason to be of the party for a single week. I am now solitary and alone, having no companion in the house with me. I have gone to wooing several gentlemen, but I have not been successful with any of them. I feel that it is not good for a man to be alone, and should not be astonished to find myself married to some old maid who can nurse me when I am sick, provide good dinners for me when I am well, and not expect from me any very ardent or romantic affection." End quote. Obviously, there's a lot to unpack in this quote, and this can be interpreted in many ways. There's the obvious modern interpretation whereby Buchanan's wooing men is referring to trying to attract men in a sexual manner. But I also want to talk about the last line because I think it's very interesting that he wants a wife for which he would not need to pay any romantic affection to. This is quite odd, and I think this is one of the reasons why Buchanan is suspected to be gay. Throughout his life, he had very few romantic relationships, and the ones that he did have, he didn't seem to prioritize them, especially when they were women. When King was on this trip, the Roosevelts, he was only gone for a little over a week, and Buchanan wrote more than one letter to him and the Roosevelts themselves. But if you remember back to when he was engaged to Anne Coleman, Buchanan would be gone for months and weeks at a time and never wrote home. I think that Buchanan and King obviously had a very special relationship. And while I don't think that anyone can conclusively say that they were romantic partners, I do think that they were more than friends. At least they had and supported each other emotionally in the way that I guess a typical relationship would. And whether or not it was sexual, I can't say, but they definitely were very close. And they two lived together for more than 16 years openly. Well, during this time, being gay wasn't really a thing in the way that I don't think many people had a word for it or really understood what it even meant. There was a surprising amount of tolerance for friendships, like the one between King and Buchanan. And on that note, I think it's important to talk about James Buchanan's life in this regard. He is a unique case, as he's the only bachelor that was ever president, and I think that we can all learn a lot from his story and his relationship with William King. These were two men who were, if we go by what they projected to the world, just friends. But they were also incredibly powerful and influential people in American politics. Although King died before Buchanan entered the presidency, I have no doubt that their friendship and relationship, whatever conclusion you have come to, had many impacts on Buchanan's role as the president. It is very well known that Buchanan was very, very lenient and overly favorable to the Southern values in the South, which was, in my opinion, one of the largest reasons why the Civil War broke out in the way that it did. And it's very interesting to see because if you look at Buchanan's past, it would almost be undoubtedly that he would have been anti-slavery and not at all favorable to the South, as he never lived there officially. But if Buchanan was a native of Pennsylvania, and he was geographically and demographically much more likely to have been anti-slavery than pro-slavery. And it's very interesting to think about the motivations that likely changed his perspective on this very contentious issue at the time. And I have no doubt that King was very influential in this matter, because slavery mattered to King very much so. He owned slaves, he represented people who owned slaves, and it was very important to his state that slavery remained legal to all his constituents, well, white constituents, I should probably preface. Slavery was the biggest issue of the time, and there was no other issue that can compare to it, ultimately, and that ultimately ended up dividing the country. Now I'm going to go a little off topic here because I'm thinking a lot more about the next presidential election that's coming up, and I I think everyone is starting to see the ads in the news, and it's becoming a thing again. And we have two big people, the big contenders, which are Trump and Biden. And I think that there are many issues right now that are sort of, I guess you could say, dividing the country. This is a generalization, but pretty geographically, if you look at it again, I think it's kind of the same northern versus southern, or I guess if you want to like get really specific, the coasts of the United States versus the central southern states. So I'm talking about like New York, California against, I don't want to say verse, but like, states like Texas, Alabama, Florida, Tennessee, for example. And I think that if we look back at the lessons that we learned from Buchanan's presidency, I think they're important to look at again today. I say that not just because we have seen sparingly, but still there from some very radical people calling for another version of a civil war and a secession, which I think is obviously not the ideal goal. And with that in mind, the same tensions and divides that were existent before this civil war are sort of reemerging themselves today. And I think that as we pick the next president for 2024, we should keep in mind that the president really does matter for the country, regardless of their roles, because presidents don't do as much as I think everyone imagines that they do. They are very important, definitely, but they don't make every decision ever. And yeah. Trying to see if I could pause. Oops. Okay, so I think what differentiated Buchanan and Lincoln was less about their views on slavery and more about who they appealed to in the country. Because Buchanan favored the South, and he did so very overtly. He played to his base of supporters and said what they wanted to hear and focused almost all of his energy on protecting half of the country's interests and essentially disregarding and ignoring the other halves, which doesn't sound that great and wasn't that great. And ironically, it's the side that he tried to appeal to the most that ended up seceding from the Union. So I don't really have any commentary on that. I just think that's a little ironic. But I think that Buchanan wasn't a bad person, and I'm sure he wasn't the perfect president, as he obviously did stuff that was pretty bad. But I also don't know what else anyone was expecting from him, as he ran and was very overtly pro the South. And he wasn't really pro the country at the time. And I think that we've seen in the last 7 years many presidential candidates and presidents themselves, I'm talking about both Trump and Biden, who put their base of supporters above finding a middle ground for the country. And it has led to the same radical views and dangerous behavior of citizens that we saw back before the Civil War. I remember learning in history class, I can't remember if this was before or after the Civil War, but I think my point still stands, about a black senator. He was either the first or one of the first black senators who was beaten on the steps of the like Senate with a cane because another senator didn't agree with him I'm pretty sure of the same party, which is absolutely crazy. But I have no doubt that we've seen similar things happen recently. And I think that if January 6th was not a wake-up call for absolutely everyone, that we have reached a point in politics where it is turning violent, I think that the attack on Nancy Pelosi's husband has to be it. And I really don't want to see what comes next if this is not it. Because it's kind of bringing us a little too close to places that we've been before in history. And I think that if anyone is watching this at all, that we should keep in mind this when we're thinking about politics in the future and the next presidential election. And I'm not exactly worried that our country's going to start another civil war, because I don't really think that's realistic at this point. But I think that we need to learn from the lessons that we should have learned from Buchanan's presidency. And I think that if anything, we need a president who is unapologetically himself, who doesn't favor one part of the country while ignoring the other, and someone who does whatever the hell they want, like Buchanan did with his relationship with William King, but also just like how Lincoln did when he handled the secession of the country. I think that we need to be mindful of bias that people have, and I honestly do believe that Buchanan's relationship with King was like one of the was pretty revolutionary for the time, but also a major cause of the Civil War. And I would even go so far as to saying, this is just my opinion, that Buchanan's favorability towards the South was maybe in his way of keeping King's legacy alive, as that was very important to King when he was in politics. And I can imagine that after losing someone who was so close to you, regardless of whether they were romantically involved or not, they were undoubtedly very close. It is hard, and he may have gone a little too far in trying to uphold King's legacy. I think that I might have gotten a little bit on a tangent, but I hope that you have gotten something out of all of these episodes, and that these stories and that all these presidents are really humans. And I've talked about JFK and Teddy Roosevelt, who are some of the most beloved and respected presidents of our history, and Buchanan, who is probably one of, if not the most shit on president. And even still, I feel like they've all become more human as I've gone through these stories, and I hope that you can see that too. So when you're thinking about voting in the 2024 election, when you see these people on TV, regardless of whether you agree with them or not, just remember that these are people too, and whether they're gay, straight, a serial cheater, or a forever lover boy, they're all unique, and you really have no idea what goes on in their lives. Unless it's a few decades later and some random teenage girl in high school decides to do a deep dive and unpack them, then we might know. But at the time, most people didn't. So anyways, I hope that you remember that, and that being the president is only half of their job, and being a human being and a member of a family is the other half. So take that as you will, but I think that we could use another Teddy Roosevelt in the office of the president, because I do miss him dearly, and he will always have a special place in my heart. And this project has only made me love him even more, which is, yeah, I don't know. Yes. I hope that, you've gotten something out of all of this that I have just talked about for the last, hour. And that, I hope that you see politics and the presidency in a different light than you did, because, it's not all about policies. I think that, their lives and their relationships have undoubtedly affected who they were and how they led the country. And I don't know, I think that it's kind of hard to just talk about one without talking about the other. And I think that we should talk about this a little bit more when we learn about these presidents in history, because they're not just policy makers or people who sign big documents. They're human beings, and their experiences have affected the way that they lead the country. And I think that we should pick someone who is actually admirable. Sorry, JFK. But yeah, I don't know. I miss Teddy Roosevelt, and I wish he could come back, and I wish I got the chance to meet him. And maybe I'm fangirling over him and no one else cares, but yeah. I hope that you learned something, and I hope that you found this podcast to be interesting, and I tried to make it as entertaining and factual as I could while also putting my own commentary in there. So, if you enjoyed it, let me know, and I hope that you do some more research about your favorite presidents, because I'm 110% sure that you will find something that you didn't really want to know or something a little juicy about their past, because it's there, you just gotta look for it. So, anyways, bye, and I hope you have a good afternoon or good night or morning, whatever time it is there. Anyways, okay, thank you for listening. Bye.